On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the November 22nd, 2021 edition of What the Ship is Going On, the top 5 news stories in the maritime sector. I am your host, Sal Mercogliano, the chair of the Department of History, Criminal Justice, and Political Science here at Campbell University, former merchant mariner, and an adjunct instructor in maritime industry policy at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. So lots of stories to talk about, many of them dealing with supply chain issues, and a few others dealing with some other factors, but all of them tough to come up with what would be the top 5 stories. But let's go ahead and give it a run. So here's story number 1. So story number 1 was an easy one for me to choose. It was my story that I just posted on G-Captain. Is the U.S. moving cargo and filling the shelves? This is a play on the White House's blog. They posted their second blog on November 17th, basically giving an assessment of where they are right now in the supply chain situation. And if you remember, they had a series of metrics that they were using. They're using 3 of them. One was the amount of ships at anchor off the port of LA and Long Beach, which I'll talk about in another story. The second involved basically how many TEUs were flowing through the ports of LA and Long Beach. And the third was basically the IRI consumer indexed. And basically what my story did is assessed where they're at. And I made a few comments based on their blog. One of the first is we're noting that in October, container levels coming through the port in LA and Long Beach are down, even though we're at record levels in terms of the year, 8.6 million TEUs through LA and Long Beach, much higher than the 7.3 at that time last year at the end of October. The month of October specifically has slowed down. We're not seeing as much cargo coming through. And I make the assertion that this has to do with the fact that the ports are trying to clear the backlog in the terminals. This is the imposition of hyperdemurrage, which they held off on imposing on November 15th. Today's November 22nd. We're waiting to hear whether or not there will be a imposition of this surcharge, or they'll push it back another week into December. Who knows? Well, we don't know yet. We'll wait and see. But I do think that this issue of claiming that the hyperdemurrage is clearing out the ports is only partially true. The other element is I don't think they're moving as many ships through the terminal. And this is indicated by the number of containers that they're moving in October. And we can expect to see actually a downturn for November too, as I'll show you in another story. We're also talking about here that one of the interesting things in this, and I'm going to jump around here because I mentioned something else in the story, but we'll talk about in another story here, is the key thing here on empties, which are not being talked about. The empties are clogging up this system. And there was a joint press conference with Gene Soroka, the head of the Port of LA, and Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation. And one of the things that Soroka was asked about sweeper vessels, these empty vessels that come in and pick up containers. And he talked about 6 had come in with 2 more coming in, and they were going to move 20,000 boxes. Well, so far, the Port of LA has exported 4.3 million containers. That is a drop in the bucket. And I really think that this issue needs to be talked about. But the one issue I really want to highlight here was a statement in the White House about the global shipping alliances. And they said this: today, a system of global alliances dominate global shipping, where 9 carriers that have been organized into 3 alliances control about 80% of the global shipping market and 95% of the critical east-west trade lines. Those 3 alliances, 2M, Ocean Alliance, and The Alliance, were the subject of a DOJ, Department of Justice investigation in 2017 that was canceled in 2019 for basically cartel antitrust violations. And it appears as if the Biden administration is giving the go-ahead for the Federal Maritime Commission or potentially the DOJ to reopen these cases and look to see whether or not these entities are, as they said here, to challenge these agreements if they produce an unreasonable reduction in transportation service or an unreasonable increase in transportation cost. We know they're doing the latter with surcharges, hyperdemurrage, all these things we're seeing done. The question here is what is going to happen? And as a result of that, the other thing I made note of in this article is we have heard nothing since the nomination of Ann Phillips to be the head of the Maritime Administration on October 21st. The Commerce Committee in the Senate has no date yet for the hearing. Maybe it's just me, but I'm thinking that this should be a priority issue. I also kind of gave a quick little assessment, which I want to talk about, which is this situation resolving itself? We're seeing a lot of discussion here about, well, things are slowing down. We're getting caught back up, but are we? Things traditionally begin to slow down, but they're not slowing down. There are a record number of ships off the port right now that still need to be offloaded. We'll talk about that. But the other thing is Chinese New Year is set for February 1st this year. Usually that's the slowdown. March is usually the slowest. The problem is going to be the ILWU is up for a contract renegotiation. Their contract expires on July 1st. If that contract is not hammered out early next year, shippers are going to front end their cargo coming to the United States. We're going to see a record rush of cargo coming across because they don't want to take the chance of the ILWU going on strike or a slowdown. And we may see this going on into 2022, even into 2023. So that is story number one. Story number two comes out of Splash 24/7, Sam Chambers. Container shipping lines smash profits made by Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. FANG, as they're known of. Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, probably the four biggest corporations in the world. Yet, when you look at this story that Sam posts right here, what he's talking about is the fact that the container companies, the container lines, just posted for Q3, the third quarter of 2021, $48.1 billion in profits. That's almost 50% higher than the total profits by FANG, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. That is an insane amount of money. All of this comes out of John McCowan from Blue Alpha Capital's report he does. He does a quarterly report on profits for the container lines, and he does a monthly report on the top 10 container ports. And one of the things you see here is what he calls this hockey stick in terms of profits. You'll see way back in 2016 and even into 2017, 2018, 2019, even early 2020, container liners were losing money, if not barely eking a profit. Then all of a sudden, they just took off. To put this into context, this is from John's report. It shows you 3Q21, third quarter 21 profits versus third quarter 20. And here you see the total profits. In third quarter of 20, they made $5 billion in profits. In 21, $48 billion. And I have to tell you, this is not complete because what's missing from here is Mediterranean Shipping Company, because Mediterranean Shipping Company is not a publicly traded company. It's owned by a family, and they don't report their profits, and they're missing. And MSC is the second largest shipping line in the world. So I'd probably add another $5 billion in here, akin to what Maersk and CMA, CGM, even Costco, the Chinese overseas shipping company, communists, made $4.8 billion. And K-Line, NYK, and Mitsubishi OSK, that's all part of ONE. They're all conglomerated together into one large, they're $4 billion. This is an insane amount of profits. And when you ask, how are they making these profits? This is how. This is the freight rates for early 2020. You'll see here freight rates. This is an infograph done by FreightWaves. The global index in January, $1,439 for a container, $1,370 for March. The most expensive route is the Southeast Asia to the East Coast. You're looking at about $2,600. Southeast Asia to West Coast, about $1,300. Fast forward to today, you're talking about 15,000, almost 16,000, Southeast Asia to East Coast. It was over 22,000. To the West Coast, almost 14,000, was over 20,000. And even the global index is sitting at 9,000, whereas it was as high as 11,000. Freight rates through the roof. You're talking about between 10 and 20 times higher. That's where these profits are being netted from. And you got to go back to this issue right here. What's in it for these companies to want to change any of this? What's going to stop these container liners from wanting to change? And I have to tell you, it's not money. Because if I was these companies, I want to keep doing exactly what's going on. They are providing poorer service for higher revenue. That is amazing. That was story number 2. Story number 3, port congestion eases in Asia while U.S. battles import deluge. So I just did a story over the weekend on Saturday. I released it. And I'm talking about the reporting of the arrival of vessels off the ports of LA and Long Beach, but this is the Asia side of that story. Port congestion eases in Asia. So one of the things we're starting to see here is Asia's largest ports are showing signs that congestion is easing ahead of the holiday season, a potential positive start for key trade gateways in that the U.S. are still battling an influx of imports. If you start looking at the ship counts, they're showing to be down. Hong Kong Shenzhen ship count dropped 10.4%. Singapore saw a week-on drop 14.7%. And so we're seeing this drop. They also note in here the White House blog showing the fact that they're moving containers off the terminal a lot faster. But I have to raise some concerns about this story. Number one, why are things slowing down in Asia? Well, things, first off, inherently slow down in Asia because all the goods needed for the holiday season had to have been shipped by now. So number one, there's that. Number two, tracking and identifying vessels in Asia has become extremely hard because the Chinese have prohibited AIS transmissions. So it's been very hard to track vessels in and around Asia right now. So you have that involved. And number three, and this is another big story, is we're seeing slowdowns in Asia due to power outages and fuel problems, and that's causing a slowdown on the Asian side at the same time. But I think this is a false indicator for what's going on in the United States. Let me explain. So this is the latest signal report out of the port of LA and Long Beach. Let me zoom out here a bit. There we go. So the port of LA and Long Beach, week 47, this week, November 21st to 27th, they're showing 84,000 containers due in. That is a 40% drop from last week. It's a 31% drop from the week before. Why are we at record lows in November? Why is this basically happening? If you go down and look at this graph that they have here, I'm going to go ahead and change myself a little bit over here. If you come down and look at this graph, this shows you their differences between the Port of LA weekly volumes. For week 47, you see this huge, massive drop from week 46, where they did 142,000 containers, down to 84,000 containers, or what they're planning on right now. This massive drop down here. Meanwhile, last year, they were up higher. As a matter of fact, we know that their October numbers, the October numbers for the Port of LA were down compared to the October numbers for last year. So you would think, okay, well, things are slowing down in LA, but they're not. How do I know they're not? If you come up here, look at the ships that are basically coming in. This is the report from today, from Monday, November 22nd. 24 ships at anchor, 3 ships due in at the anchorage, 18.5 days wait they're showing. If you go over to Long Beach is showing very similar aspects about this. These are the ships at anchor right now in Long Beach. If you come down here to the very bottom, they're showing 34 vessels out at the anchorage November 22nd. So Monday, again, they're showing the vessels out. The problem I have with this entire thing, this and this, is they're not showing all the vessels. Come out here to marine traffic. This is the anchorages we know. Here's the Port of LA. Here's LA, excuse me. Here's Long Beach. Here are the anchorages. If you zoom out a little bit, here you see the holding ground. Here you see the ships off in the drift area. Not all these vessels are showing up in the reports by LA and Long Beach. For example, down here is MSC Anns, container ship ETA into Long Beach, November 26. If you come here to Long Beach, MSC Anns, she's not showing up. She's not on the list. And I have to tell you, I went through the LA and the Long Beach list. And as you do this, and more importantly, as you go further out here, especially far out here into this 350-mile area out here, you see ships drifting around: CMA, CGM, Topaz, Maersk, Edrin, Everfine, YN Topmast, Maersk, Avora, for example. These vessels are basically Cape Jackson. Some of these vessels are just transiting through. This one's heading down to Mexico, you can see right here. But we're seeing more and more of these vessels that are not showing up on this. They're way out into the anchorage, and even some that are closer in on the anchorage and here in the drift zone are not showing up. So we're not getting the full numbers in the ports of LA and Long Beach. And one of the things I think that's happening here, and I don't have proof for it, but I'm happy for LA and Long Beach to give me a call and let me know. They can email me. I've emailed them repeatedly with no response back. You know, it seems like the port of LA and Long Beach are slowing down the arrival of vessels, the processing of vessels, so that they can clear out the port, which is fine. They should go ahead and say that's what they're doing, but they're not. And this goes back to my original story number one, where this misleading of data is really, it doesn't help them. I think it's being very disingenuous. If you are telling me that the size of the anchorage is decreasing, but there's more ships arriving now and you're not reporting them, and you're decreasing the number of containers coming off the terminals, you can't tell me it's because of the hyper-demerge fee. What you're doing is you're taking in less containers into the terminal, and this is allowing you to move containers off. And the one thing that's missing in all of this is a report on the empties and exports. How many of them are not just being moved? We have that number. We know how many exported every month and how many are heading out. What we don't know is how many are sitting on the terminal. We have dwell reports for imports, but not for exports. And that is story number 3. Story number 4 is a story I did last week on the Port of Vancouver and the fact that rail service has been cut between Vancouver and Kamloops. I received a lot of comments about whether I said Kamloops right or not, and I appreciate everybody who was very nice to me about my Canadian pronunciation. So I appreciate it. The Port of Vancouver has been cut off. The CN, CP rail lines have been severed. They're talking about them restarting this week, but also hearing a lot of issues about whether or not that will be true. We know this is a story in American Shipper talking about the fact that 47 ships are waiting at the docks to offload. Remember that there's 2 aspects here to Vancouver that's really important for us to understand. Number one, offload. These are containers being offloaded in Vancouver to provide goods all across Canada in all the major cities, all the way out to Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and including into the US Midwest, Chicago. Major rail lines, a lot of goods coming out of Vancouver to go into the interior of Canada and United States, but also exports. Grain and ore are piled up on sidings everywhere, waiting to come out of the fields of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. That is essential to flow this. They are right now dumping the grain elevators, but they will deplete the grain elevators pretty quickly unless they can get trains rolling in here to restore this balance. We know that there's some panic buying going on, getting reports of shelves being emptied out in British Columbia because of this. Again, one of the things we know is goods are coming into Vancouver. The question is getting them out of Vancouver. And so this has a big impact. And again, one of the things we're seeing is how weather can relate this. Heavy rains washed away the roadways in the Fraser River Valley there. We're also seeing it in the railroad. Hopefully they get everything restored fairly soon. They're using Prince Rupert, which is a port further north in British Columbia, but it's a much smaller port. It also is at the end of a very long rail line to get there. So it's not going to be as efficient as reopening up of Vancouver. And again, thoughts and prayers with everybody in British Columbia, hoping to see this be resolved soon. And I will keep up on this story. Story number 5 deals with liquefied natural gas and carrier spot rates hitting an all-time high. So talked a lot about supply chain in this update, but there's other news out there and there's other modes of transportation. Could have talked about the fact that Disney was going to require vaccinations for all children on board on the cruise lines. Could have talked about the bulk market and what's going on with bulkers. Could have talked about tankers, but this story from Sam Chambers at Splash 24/7, I thought was an interesting one, just hit today. But the rates here are just amazing. LNG carrier spot rates have hit all-time highs on the Pacific. Rates for ships hauling gas from Australia to Japan hit $335,000 per day on Friday. This is an amazing amount of money being made. Japan's wholesale spot power price surged today to the highest level ever for the time of the year. Remember, Japan, which had an issue with nuclear power with Fukushima, has basically shifted a lot of its power sources over to LNG. And the demand is up for LNG around the world. Europe, Asia, India, China, Japan. The United States has LNG. Qatar has LNG. Australia has LNG. And we're seeing that being shipped. And for a cold year, it can result in gas inventories being depleted very quickly. And that's going to cause LNG prices to spike. The US, which is one of the biggest producers of LNG, do not have LNG carriers on their own, even though the US built them back in the 1970s and 80s. Very early on, the US developed LNG technology. We let it atrophy and go away. And now we see LNG carriers being built largely in Korea. Korea has really been the cornerstone for building LNG technology. But shipping companies, Qatar, a variety of other energy producers are really cornering this market. And if you get a cold winter coming ahead like they're forecasting, energy is going to be an interesting market to watch. We already know about energy issues in China, demand for coal. China is largely coal-fired in their power, but a lot of other countries, and China is also doing it too, shifting over to LNG because of its cleaner nature and its availability. LNG carriers are really dangerous vessels that they handle liquefied natural gas by compressing it at high pressure and low temperatures. So this market is going to be really interesting to watch. If you're chartering vessels for $335,000 a day, $1 million every 3 days, you can pay for this cost of this vessel in just a few months. And everything else above that then is profit, except for maintenance and operational costs. And so expect to see LNG carriers popping off the ways here really soon. So top 5 stories, a lot to process right there. I hope you enjoyed the recap. Again, what we try to do on what the ship is going on is give you a taste of what's going on in the past week in the news and what to look forward to coming forward. It's going to be really interesting to watch what happens in LA and Long Beach. Will those reportings change? Will we start seeing indications of those vessels in those far off anchorages or drift zones, 350 miles off the coast? What happens here? Will LA, Long Beach catch up on their containers? What's going on with the empties coming out? Same thing with the Port of Vancouver. Hopefully those rail lines get reopened up. We're coming into full bore holiday season. People are ordering like crazy. So we're going to see a lot of stress on the maritime sector. And the North Pacific in wintertime is not a place to be drifting 350 to 500 miles off the coast. We saw vessels route through poor weather and lose containers with the Zim Kingston, for example. Don't want to see that happen off the southern coast of California. So, till our next report, Sal, signing off.